For nearly 1,000 years, the samurai were the unchallenged warrior elite of Japan. They shaped the destiny of emperors and shoguns, defended castles, and carried the weight of honor like armor upon their souls. But by the mid-19th century, their power, their privileges, and even their very existence were being pulled away piece by piece. The fall of the samurai is not simply a story of military defeat. It is the tale of a class that defined a nation and then vanished in a single generation. The story begins in the Tokugawa era, also called the Edo period, which stretched from 1603 until 1868. When Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara and established his shogunate, Japan entered more than 250 years of relative peace. For a land that had been torn apart by civil wars for centuries, this stability was revolutionary. The samurai, who had once spent their lives on horseback and in battlefields, suddenly found themselves with little fighting to do. Their swords remained at their sides, but they were rarely stained with blood. Instead, the samurai became administrators, teachers, and bureaucrats. They collected taxes, oversaw legal disputes, and enforced the shogun's laws. They remained at the top of the rigid Tokugawa social order: samurai above farmers, farmers above artisans, artisans above merchants. But in practice, this hierarchy was beginning to crack. Merchants, officially considered the lowest class because they created nothing with their hands, grew wealthy through trade. Samurai, meanwhile, were often stuck living on fixed stipends from their lords, payments that lost value as the economy evolved. By the 18th and 19th centuries, countless samurai families were struggling to survive. This paradox was everywhere. Merchants who were legally beneath samurai often had more money, more influence, and even more power than the warriors themselves. Samurai who once commanded respect now sometimes borrowed from the very people they looked down upon. Debt became a quiet shame among the warrior class. Some samurai pawned their armor, others sold treasured swords, and many were forced to take humiliating side jobs in secret. For a class that prided itself on honor, this was a slow and painful erosion of dignity. Yet the samurai still carried prestige. They alone had the right to wear the two swords, the katana and the wakizashi, known together as the daisho. This was their badge of status, even if their blades were no longer used in battle. They studied calligraphy, Confucian philosophy, and martial arts not for war, but to maintain the discipline of their forefathers. But beneath the surface of this proud image, resentment and insecurity grew. The world was changing, and the samurai were no longer its masters. The true earthquake came from beyond Japan's shores. For more than 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had maintained an isolationist policy known as sakoku. Foreign trade was tightly restricted, Christianity was banned, and Japan's ports were closed to most outsiders. This isolation gave the samurai a sense of control. But the world beyond Japan was shifting rapidly. European empires expanded, and Western navies patrolled the seas with ironclad ships and cannons unlike anything Japan possessed. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States arrived in Edo Bay with a squadron of black-hulled warships. The sight was terrifying. Smoke belching from their stacks, cannons bristling on their decks. The samurai who observed them realized instantly that their swords and matchlock muskets were useless against such power. Perry's message was simple: open Japan to trade or face destruction. The shogunate, recognizing its weakness, signed treaties that heavily favored the Americans and later the Europeans. These unequal treaties were humiliations that shocked the nation. For the samurai, it was a moment of collective shame. Their leaders, once guardians of Japan's independence, had capitulated without a fight. Many warriors whispered that the shogun had lost his legitimacy. The arrival of the West created a profound identity crisis. On one side were the Sono Joy advocates. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. They demanded the foreigners be driven out and Japan restored to its pure traditions. On the other side were reformers who believed survival required modernization, new weapons, new industries, and even new ways of governance. Both groups included samurai, but their visions for Japan were irreconcilable. Economic strain only deepened the crisis. Samurai stipends were already insufficient, and now inflation made them nearly worthless. Meanwhile, Western merchants flooded Japanese markets with cheap goods, undercutting local artisans. Samurai, who once embodied stability, now looked like relics. Men in robes with swords they could no longer afford to sharpen. Discontent simmered into rebellion in some domains, while others plotted to overthrow the Tokugawa entirely. The final decades of samurai dominance were marked by violence and turmoil. Assassinations of shogunate officials by radical samurai became common in Kyoto. Foreigners were attacked in the streets. Ronin, masterless samurai, roamed the country, some turning to banditry, others fighting in the name of restoration. It was clear that the old order could not hold. By the 1860s, two powerful domains, Satsuma and Choshu, emerged as the heart of resistance. They were led by ambitious samurai who recognized that Japan needed both tradition and modernity to survive. These domains smuggled in Western weapons, built modern shipyards, and trained their men in new tactics, even as they still invoked the emperor as a symbol of legitimacy. Their clash with the shogunate became inevitable. In 1868, the Boshin War erupted. Samurai loyal to the shogun faced off against samurai aligned with the emperor. For the first time in Japanese history, battles were fought with modern rifles, cannons, and even ironclad warships. The shogunate's armies, many of them traditional samurai with swords and outdated muskets, were devastated. The war culminated in the Battle of Toba Fushimi, where imperial forces armed with modern weapons crushed the shogun's army. The shogunate collapsed, and the emperor was restored to power in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. In reality, it was not the emperor who ruled, but a coalition of reformist samurai leaders from Satsuma and Choshu. Still, the symbolism was undeniable. The shogun was gone. The centuries-old system that had defined Japan was over. But for the samurai as a class, the real pain had only begun. The new Meiji government sought to modernize Japan at lightning speed. They knew that to survive in a world of empires, Japan needed factories, railroads, and above all, a modern military. This required dismantling the old feudal order. Samurai stipends were first cut, then converted into government bonds, and finally abolished altogether. Suddenly, thousands of samurai families lost their only source of income. The most shocking blow came in 1876 when the government passed the Hitori Edict. It forbade the wearing of swords in public. For the samurai, this was unthinkable. The sword was not only a weapon but the very symbol of their identity. To be seen without it was to admit they were no longer samurai at all. Many warriors wept as they laid down blades that had been in their families for generations. In place of the samurai army, the Meiji government established a conscript army of commoners. Farmers, laborers, and merchants now carried rifles and wore uniforms, while former samurai were expected to find new roles in a society that no longer had a place for them. Some adapted, becoming teachers, businessmen, or politicians. Others could not. Many samurai felt betrayed. They had fought to restore the emperor, and now the emperor's government had destroyed their class. Discontent spread like fire through the former warrior ranks. Outbreaks of violence occurred across the country as samurai rose in revolt against the new order. But the Meiji government, with its modern army and Western weapons, crushed each rebellion. The proud warriors of Japan who had once ruled with steel were now no match for rifles and cannons. And yet, the samurai spirit refused to vanish quietly. In the next part, we will explore the desperate last stands of the samurai. Uprisings like the famous Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigō Takamori, the last true samurai. These battles were not only the end of the warrior class, but also the birth of modern Japan. The 1870s were a decade of transformation and of tragedy for the samurai. Their stipends were gone, their swords forbidden, and their authority erased by the Meiji government. But while some samurai adapted, others chose rebellion. They refused to let their world die quietly. The most famous of these uprisings was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigō Takamori. Once a key supporter of the Meiji Restoration, Saigō had become disillusioned with the government's rapid westernization and its betrayal of the samurai class. In Satsuma, in southern Japan, discontent was strongest. Thousands of dispossessed samurai rallied to Saigō's side. They saw him as the last champion of their honor. Armed mostly with swords and outdated rifles, the rebels marched north. At first, their courage and discipline gave them victories, but the odds were against them. The Imperial Japanese Army, made up of commoner conscripts trained with modern tactics and equipped with Western artillery and rifles, outnumbered them heavily. The rebels fought fiercely, but each battle drained their strength. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Shiroyama in September 1877. Surrounded, outgunned, and starving, the last 500 samurai made their stand against 30,000 government troops. The morning air was filled with cannon fire and rifle volleys, but the samurai charged again and again with their swords, refusing to surrender. By the end of the day, nearly all were dead. Saigō himself was mortally wounded, and according to legend, he committed seppuku before the enemy could take him. The Satsuma Rebellion ended in blood, but it also ended an era. Never again would the samurai rise in arms to shape Japan's future. The warrior class, once the most powerful in the nation, had been crushed by the very modern state they had helped to create. Yet, even in defeat, the samurai left a mark that would never fade. Their ideals of loyalty, discipline, and courage were absorbed into the new Japan. The modern imperial army adopted elements of the samurai spirit, teaching recruits the value of sacrifice and duty. Writers and artists transformed the samurai into symbols of national pride. Even as swords became ceremonial relics, the image of the samurai endured. By the early 20th century, the samurai had become legends. They lived on in literature, theater, and eventually film. The code of bushido was reinterpreted and popularized as the spiritual backbone of Japan, inspiring soldiers, politicians, and everyday citizens. The samurai were gone, but their shadow stretched across modern Japan. The fall of the samurai is a story of change, of how a warrior class that ruled for centuries was swept away in a single generation. It is also a reminder that no matter how powerful, no order lasts forever. Guns replaced swords, industry replaced tradition, and the world moved forward. But the samurai remain eternal in memory, figures of steel and spirit whose rise and fall shaped the destiny of Japan.